hand holding a weapon. And it goes on to talk about how they were prepared to fight at any minute. They were doing the work they needed to do, but they were prepared to fight at any minute. They were not apathetic. They were aware of the situation, very keenly aware of what was at stake. And guys, Satan is doing his level best to disperse us, to get us busy about many things. And those things in and of themselves are not wrong, right? I mean, there's a lot of things we can do that aren't wrong in and of themselves. But when they stack up and when they take precedence over what's most important, we're getting scattered. And we're in a dangerous situation. We're not aware of what's going on around us. What's our next challenge? Why are we changing? We need to understand why we're changing. We need to understand what's going on. Am I? Yes. Okay. There's been a lot of talk about statistics. Some of you may have heard the Fuller Institute did a study on and they put a book out called Sticky Faith, and they tracked teenagers. I think it was like somewhere around 500 students through college, and what those that stuck with their faith and those that didn't. And so the question is, are we changing because the statistics say so? Is that why we're changing? Some of the stats said 40 to 50% of teens that graduate from a youth group will lose their faith in college. And of those that leave the faith, 30 to 60% will return in their late 20s or early 30s. Those are pretty big gaps there in those numbers, right? But is that why we're changing? I want to say no, that's not why we're changing. Those numbers are for other people. I mean, we can note that, but when I started reading those books and started looking at the material, they started saying, well, here's a way that we can stop, here's a stopgap thing that we can do. How about the youth worship together with the congregation? So this is the denominational background this information comes from. And so their youth weren't even worshiping with the body. And I was like, what? We don't do that. We have everybody together. And so what does that do? It's starting to us to understand that we're comparing apples to oranges, right? We're not comparing the same situation. This is not Palm Beach Lakes information. It's something for us to give pause and note, but it is not the same data. So we're not changing necessarily for the statistics. Some of the statistics talked about the importance of parents and the faith of children, and that's across the board true. Educators, how many educators are in this room? Former, current, otherwise. Educators, do you note the difference in children whose parents are involved in their education and those who are not? They're all shaking their heads. Do you think it makes a difference if parents are involved in the faith process as well? That's just nature, guys. I mean, kids learn by watching and observing. It's scary how much they're learning, right? And so that's true across the board. The next thing they said that was very important, and this brings in the idea of community, is that they were involved in such a way that there were other people involved in their lives. 5 to 7 other individuals in the congregation were involved in that teenager's life. As a mentor, as somebody who noticed them, who took the time to talk to them, who also exampled what it was to be a faithful Christian to them. And we see that in the New Testament also. And we're going to talk about that here in just a second. So that's to understand it. We need to understand why we're changing. Look in the next slide talks about how it's best we're changing because this provides the best for growth, provides the most growth for the body. We talked about Ephesians 6, verse 4, how that parents have the main responsibility. But again, Ephesians 4:16 talks about every individual part doing its best for the building up of the growth. And so that fits the biblical model. It fits this idea, this concept. And this needs to be the reason for the change. The numbers are for a different group. And if we're ministering to numbers for other people, we're not really ministering to us, are we? We're ministering to a situation that's for other people. So the numbers can't be the reason we're all be changing. We need to be changing because it's best for the body. Another challenge is, who are the youth? Who are the youth? I'm not talking about those who are young at heart, but we need to know who the youth are and have a right concept of who they are. There used to be an idea that youth are better to be seen, not heard. Have you heard that? I was told that. And there's some, I'm not going to get into it, but we need to understand who the youth are. When you're raising your children, you're not raising them just to be productive citizens in the community. Are you? Or are we? We're raising them to be saints in the kingdom. We're raising them to be fellow workers. Father, son, deacons. How awesome would that be? To be a deacon alongside your son. So we're raising them to be fellow workers. We need to understand who they are. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, it talks about this a little bit, about youth and despising youth. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12. Let no one look down on your youthfulness. That's the literal idea when it says despise in the King James. The literal idea is to look down upon youth. And that's easy for us to look down upon youth these days. How many times have we said that? Or that concept, youth these days. And I'm not saying, we just need to understand that if they're a baptized Christian, they need to be working in the kingdom. We need to have higher expectations. Our expectation of our youth should not be that they go to Bible class and they behave themselves up here in these pews and then they go to youth events. That should not be the end of our expectation for our youth. We're raising the bar a little bit, guys. Okay. Just so you know, we want to work alongside you guys. Does that make sense? But the text here says not just to not despise our youth, or not, in Timothy, this is Paul talking to Timothy here. But he expected Timothy to be an example in all things, but rather in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and purity, show yourself an example. Paul expected that out of Timothy. And we need to expect that out of our youth as well. Look in Psalm. Psalm has some interesting things to say about youth. Psalm 78. If I can find it fast enough. Some of y'all are beating me. All right, Psalm 78, verses 5 through 7. Is there somebody who wants to read this for us? Read it loud and proud. Anybody?
For he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, the children who would be born, that they may arise and declare them to their children, that they may set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments.
Awesome. And so this passage is talking about future generations. The generation to come might know, even the children yet to be born. And I was talking to Dan about this the other day, and he said, you know what, Josh, and Dan said a few things from time to time that's just like, wow. He's guilty of doing that. His wife says yes. But he said, I'm getting there. Dramatic pause. Wait for it. Okay. He said that you're not raising just your kids. You're raising your grandchildren. Think about it for a second. How many times have you said something that you promised you never would say, that you heard your father say 1,000,000 times? I've said it, and as the words were leaving my mouth, I was like, no. I can't believe I said that. You know, when you're raising your children, you're instilling in them things that are just burned on their hard drive. And in the first 7 years of their life, 5 to 7 years of their life, you've set the foundation of how it's going to be. First 5 to 7 years of your child's life. And you can't change that. You can't change that. My parents adopted a child at 7. He had a horrible, I'm not going to go into details. It is not appropriate to talk about the things that happened in his life before he was 7. And after that, it was crisis management. It's like, let's just try and shore this up and do the best, because those things were already happened. Now, I'm not saying that it's his past fault. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying his life could have been different if his first 7 years were different. First 7 years are critical for the life of a child and what their outcome is going to be. What they see you do, they will mimic. How Josiah and Vivian see me take care of Kara, Josiah and Vivian will mimic. Even though when I kiss Kara, they go, ew, I don't want to see that. They're going to mimic that. So when we're raising our children, you're instilling in them things that they're going to be repeating. And y'all are going to do, it's going to happen, guys. At some point, y'all are going to say things or do things that you said you never were going to do. And I stand before you as witness that it's going to happen. Just when it happens, just don't tell them. That's the only thing you got. Look in 2 Timothy. Let's go back to Timothy again. Timothy's a good guy, right? Paul had a really good relationship with this young man. And there's a reason why. And we're going to look at that here in 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5. And he talks about his relationship here with Timothy. And he says in verse 5, "For I am mindful of the sincere faith within you, which first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. And I am sure it is in you as well." What is that? What is that, guys? That's Psalm 78. I didn't see, for single ladies, I didn't see a man mentioned there. That's just his life. That's just what folded out in his life. What first dwelt in your grandmother and was in your mother was in Timothy. Now, Timothy had something to do with it, obviously. You guys have a choice, obviously. But how did it start? It started tens of years ago. Before Timothy was born, his grandmother was making choices about how their household was going to be. Are you making those choices now? Are you preparing for your grandchildren? I'm not talking about setting aside special toys. That's important, My grandma brings out those toys. Those toys, oh, your dad played with these toys. Like, that's awesome. Thank you so much. And it is neat to see that, right? But that's not what I'm talking about. Are you preparing for your grandchildren now? And we need to understand who our youth are, because we're preparing for something much bigger. Are we preparing for elders 20, 40, 30 years from now? Jerry, I love you, brother. But you're not going to be around forever. That's just it, right? It happens to every one of us. These guys have been elders for a long time. I'm not even close to being done yet, guys. Nobody's yawning tonight. That's awesome. But are we preparing for the future? Are we preparing for the future for this congregation. What are our challenges? What are some of our own challenges? We're going to have to go through this pretty quickly because we got 5 minutes apparently. We took a Gallup poll. This is a very scientific process. And we polled some members of the church. Basically, we offered them food and said, would you mind filling out a card? That's how you do that here. Here are some of our challenges. We want some of our numbers, right? 44% of the people that we polled, by polled I mean people that filled out a card, they were nice enough to do that for us. They said that the spiritual disciplines were the most difficult challenge for them. And by spiritual disciplines, and I'm not talking about, spiritual disciplines, we're talking about prayer, Bible reading, and devotionals. And those are what were specifically mentioned. But those are what we talk about when we put spiritual disciplines. So those 44% mentioned that was their main struggle, spiritually. 26%, this one I did not see coming. I should have seen it coming, but I didn't see it coming. 26% of the people said they had a problem with self-concept of who they were. Low self-esteem. This is what one person said. The devil can be very convincing in leading us to believe that we are not worthy. Can you relate to that? How many times do we hear self-talk saying, well, you've messed up. You're not worthy of that. How many times have we heard that? That you're not worthy, and that some members of the church have a negative, preconceived notion of you. Everybody thinks bad of me. Everybody knows what I've done wrong. Now, they're not saying that they think that. They're saying that's what they think other people are thinking. That's dangerous waters, right? It's dangerous waters when you think you know what everybody else is thinking. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. So self-concept. Can we as a family bolster the self-concept? You are worth something. You have a relationship with me and with God. 19 people said relationship with or behavior of other Christians. One person wrote, it can be extremely challenging reaching out to a Christian brother or sister who may feel condemned or guarded due to sin. And it is a challenge. Sometimes we don't know what to say, honestly, right? People are hurting. We know. We see them. But we don't know what to say. We don't know what to do. Maybe we can work on that. Another person wrote, as a Christian, I struggle with bitterness. It stems from a troubled childhood and a tumultuous young adult period, but being rejected in the past by members of the church, it's a huge struggle to overcome. We can be our own worst enemy, right? If we're not putting in practice the things we need to be putting in practice. I have met the enemy and we are it. If we're not putting in practice godly principles. Another person wrote, getting past the 5-minute 4-year relationships. And we can work on that. I think most of us are working on that. But how are we going to address these changes? How are we going to address these challenges, guys? How are we going to do that? Well, next Wednesday we're going to talk about that. But the major concept, there's always got to be a plug, right? Next Wednesday, we're going to talk about that. How are we going to address these challenges? You can't just put a Band-Aid on these things, right? You can't just put a Band-Aid on it. You can't, I'm just going to pray more. New Year's resolution. This is not New Year's resolution situation. We're going to have to change culture. To address the challenges, we're going to have to change culture. And by that, I mean we're going to have to make earth-shattering changes in our families. We want to be preparing for the grandchildren, raising our children right. We're going to have to make changing culture situation. We're going to talk about what that means, what culture is, the stresses of going through a change. How many times have you tried to change something and it gets to the point where it's like, it's so difficult and you give up and you go back? Have you ever done that? New Year's resolution, the first little bit, you're excited about it. I'm going to do this. You bought a new outfit to exercise in. You're going to look great like everybody else in the gym, right? And then a month later, you're not getting in that outfit anymore. We're going to talk about that process and how we can overcome that next Wednesday. Any questions, comments, shout-outs? Sorry, it didn't end up being... It ended up being more lecture. I'm sorry. Dan, I'm sorry. I messed up. I'm going to need you to talk next Wednesday. We're going to talk about culture. All right? Be praying about it. Thank you, guys.